The bar was the kind of place where the lights were always dim, and the music was just loud enough to drown out the noise of the city outside. It was a popular spot, known for its extensive drink menu and sleek modern decor that attracted a steady stream of patrons from all walks of life. Tonight, it was particularly busy, with the after-work crowd mingling over cocktails and craft beers, the low hum of conversation filling the air. Ethan pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. He was immediately struck by the warmth of the place, a stark contrast to the cool autumn night outside. Dressed in a tailored suit and polished shoes, he looked every bit the successful young professional. As he moved further into the bar, he noticed a few heads turn, but he was used to that. His presence had a way of commanding attention, not just because of his sharp appearance, but also because of the quiet confidence he exuded. He walked over to the bar, scanning the rows of bottles lining the shelves. The bartender, Greg, was busy chatting with a group of customers at the far end of the counter. Ethan took a seat on one of the high stools, placing his phone and wallet on the counter in front of him. He caught Greg's eye and nodded politely, a silent signal that he was ready to order. But Greg didn't respond. Instead, he turned back to the group of young professionals he had been serving, laughing at something one of them said. Ethan frowned slightly but didn't think much of it at first. It was a busy night, and bartenders had to juggle multiple orders at once. He could wait a few more minutes. As he waited, Ethan looked around the bar, observing the scene. It was a typical Thursday night crowd, mostly people in their 20s and 30s unwinding after a long day at work. The place had a relaxed yet lively atmosphere, with groups of friends gathered around tables, couples sitting close together, and solo patrons like him taking a moment to themselves. Minutes passed, and Ethan noticed that Greg still hadn't come over to take his order. He watched as Greg served another customer who had just walked up to the bar, a man, white and casually dressed, who was immediately greeted with a smile and a prompt offer to take his order. Ethan's frown deepened. He straightened up in his seat, raising his hand slightly to catch Greg's attention again. "Excuse me," Ethan called out, his voice calm but firm. Greg glanced in his direction, his expression unreadable. For a brief moment, their eyes met, but then Greg turned away, pretending not to have heard. Instead, he moved further down the bar, pouring drinks for a pair of women who had just arrived. Ethan's patience began to wear thin. He had been nothing but polite, but it was clear now that Greg was deliberately ignoring him. A knot of frustration formed in his chest, but he forced himself to remain composed. He wasn't going to make a scene. Not yet. He glanced around, noticing that a few other patrons were watching the interaction, or rather, the lack thereof. He leaned forward on the counter, tapping his fingers lightly against the polished wood. His mind raced, trying to understand what was happening. Was this just bad service? Or was there something more to it? The uncomfortable possibility that this was about more than just a busy night at the bar began to creep into his thoughts. Just then, Greg approached another customer, a young woman who had taken a seat a few stools down from Ethan. She smiled at Greg, who smiled back, his demeanor warm and friendly. Ethan watched as Greg effortlessly engaged her in conversation, recommending a drink from the menu. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to steady his rising irritation. He wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but the signs were becoming too obvious to ignore. He had been at the bar long before these other customers, yet Greg had chosen to serve everyone else but him. The tension in the air thickened as Ethan sat there, his patience wearing thinner with each passing second. He was no stranger to subtle slights, the kind that others might overlook or dismiss, but this was blatant. His thoughts began to swirl with frustration and disbelief, but he kept his expression neutral, refusing to let the situation get the better of him. Ethan's attention snapped back to Greg, who was now laughing at a joke the young woman had made. It was clear that the bartender had no intention of serving him, and the realization hit Ethan like a cold slap. He glanced around the bar once more, hoping to catch the eye of another bartender, or perhaps even the manager. But Greg seemed to be the only one behind the counter tonight. Ethan clenched his jaw, feeling the sting of the situation. It wasn't just about being ignored, it was about what this implied. He could feel the eyes of the other patrons on him, some of them aware of the growing tension. others blissfully unaware as they enjoyed their evening. But for Ethan, this was more than just an inconvenience. It was a reminder of the subtle yet painful ways discrimination could manifest, even in the most seemingly progressive places. His patience now replaced with a simmering frustration. Ethan had been waiting for what felt like an eternity, though in reality, it had only been about 20 minutes. 20 minutes of being blatantly ignored while others were promptly served. The irritation that had started as a small flicker was now a steady flame, burning hotter with each passing moment. Greg, the bartender, continued to move about the bar with an air of casual indifference, serving one customer after another. Ethan watched as Greg chatted with the regulars, joked with the newcomers, and even offered a few free samples to a group of young men in suits who had clearly just come from work. Yet, each time Greg glanced in Ethan's direction, there was a coldness, a deliberate choice to look away and focus on someone else. The bar, which had once seemed so inviting, now felt stifling to Ethan. He glanced around at the other patrons. Some were too absorbed in their conversations to notice what was happening, while others occasionally shot him sympathetic glances. But no one said anything. No one intervened. It was as if the scene was playing out in a vacuum, where Ethan's frustration and anger existed in isolation. A man sitting a few stools down leaned over and whispered to his companion, who looked over at Ethan and then at Greg. The companion shook his head slightly, a small gesture of disapproval, but neither of them did more than exchange a knowing glance. Ethan caught this interaction and felt a pang of resentment. It wasn't enough to be seen. He wanted someone, anyone, to acknowledge what was happening, to validate the injustice of it all. He cleared his throat, the sound more forceful this time, cutting through the low hum of the bar. "Excuse me," Ethan said again, louder, his voice carrying a subtle edge that hadn't been there before. This time, Greg couldn't ignore him. The bartender turned, a faint expression of surprise on his face. "Oh, sorry," Greg said, though his tone was anything but apologetic. "Didn't see you there. What can I get you?" Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly as he met Greg's gaze. "I've been waiting for a while," he replied evenly, though the frustration was clear in his voice. "A bourbon neat, please." Greg nodded, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, annoyance, perhaps, or maybe disdain. He turned away to grab a glass, but as he did, Ethan noticed the subtle roll of his eyes. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but it spoke volumes. Ethan's jaw tightened. He had seen that look before, countless times in different settings, and it always carried the same message. "You're not welcome here."